Joining me today in the studio to discuss Hamas's change of leadership and the emerging humanitarian crisis in Gaza is Dr. Mordechai Kedar, who served for 25 years in the IDF military intelligence and is an expert in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So let's begin. Last week, Hamas elected Ismail Haniyeh as their new leader. Now, how will this change Hamas's policies, if at all, especially towards Israel?
Not much, if at all. First of all, Khalid Mash'al, the so far leader, remains very close to the leadership. So, as long as he is there, real changes cannot be introduced by anyone. Secondly, Haniyeh and Mash'al are more or less the two sides of the same coin of the terror and hatred against Israel. Of course, they have some differences because Haniyeh is from Gaza Strip and Mash'al is from the West Bank, but they worked very well together so far. The only change which we can already see is that the weight of the Gaza people in Hamas in general becomes bigger, while those who did not live in Gaza or didn't function in Gaza
Now, why is that the
becomes
case?
weaker. Because Gaza is a state. And don't forget that Ismail Haniyeh already in June, like less than a month from today, they celebrate the 10th anniversary of their state in Gaza, after they took over Gaza from the PLO. So Haniyeh definitely showed that he can deliver by running a state. And 3 wars against Israel, 3 rounds of violence, and he survived personally and with the organization and with the state which he has. Definitely big achievement.
Now, one issue that is, on many Israelis' minds is the remains of Hadar Goldin and Oron Shaul, two IDF soldiers who are still being held by Hamas. Do you think this will in any way affect the negotiations that will exist in terms of getting their bodies out of Gaza and back to Israel, and also the release of Avraham Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed from Gaza, two mentally disabled Israelis that are in Gaza?
On the contrary, I think it will be harder now. Not because of Haniyeh and Mash'al, just because the new leader of Hamas in Gaza, which is a guy named Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar is a killer, and he was in jail forever, lifetime. But he was released in the Shalit swap. And he became one of the, since he came back to Gaza, he became one of the real, I would say, militant leaders of Hamas. And this actually what gave him the elevation to become the next leader of Hamas, and he will replace Haniyeh, who will go to the political bureau of Hamas. And when Sinwar is there, definitely he is much more radical, much more precise than Haniyeh, and I don't see any softening in the line of Hamas, especially when this document which they published last week doesn't really change the music.
Now, speaking of that policy paper, some are saying that this represents a significant change in Hamas's ideology, but Israel says, no, that's not the case. And today, Hamas did come out and say that we still are advocating for the destruction of the Jewish state. So is there any impact that this charter is going to have at all?
The main question was, what will be the status of this, before the content? Whether it will replace the charter, which calls to destroy Israel totally, or not. And the title of this new document is something different. It's not a charter. It is a policy paper. Means something much lower, and they actually update the policies which they make vis-a-vis Israel. They don't recognize Israel. The only new thing in this document is that they are ready to establish a Palestinian state on the borders of which were between 1948 and 1967. Yet they don't recognize Israel. They demand Jerusalem, and they demand the return of millions of refugees into Israel as a preamble. Of course, they don't say it, but as a preamble to topple Israel altogether.
Now, I'd like to turn to the issue of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The PA has refused to pay for medical and fuel shipments to the Strip now. And, the question is, why are they refusing to do this all of a sudden? If the PA is the legitimate governing body of the Gaza Strip and its citizens, doesn't that mean they're responsible for the welfare of the people?
Well, first of all, the money which was funneled into the Palestinian Authority is reduced recently because many of the donors in the world do not like their money to go straight to the accounts in Switzerland, which those officials have. So in order to reduce the expenses, they decided not to sponsor anymore things in Gaza. After all, Gaza is under Hamas for 10 years. Hamas actually is a challenge to the PLO, so why should the PLO or the PA pay for something which they don't benefit from in Gaza? So this is one thing, and this actually broadens the gap between the PLO and Gaza and Hamas, which again proves that to talk about one Palestinian people is a deception, is some kind of something which doesn't exist anymore. These are two different cultures.
All right, Dr. Mordechai Kedar, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.